surpassed, penetrating and perfect Dharma. It is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everybody. So it seems polite to ask if you can hear, but there's not a whole lot I can do about it if you can't. So maybe it's better I don't say anything.
People that have difficulty hearing could come forward.
Well, it might be better forward, it might be better way back by the speakers, somewhere in between is probably really bad. And so if you are really having hearing trouble, actually full invitation, we have this sort of Zen thing like, don't move. But it's fun, once you get up and try different parts of the room. We had John Craycraft a year ago is like a totally geeky sound engineer, and he did like a sound quality map, which I'm afraid we've probably lost by now, but oh, you have it. Wonderful. So he found some areas were kind of dead zones. Do you remember what the dead zones were? Tell us.
Corners and the edges.
Corners and edges are bad. So anyway.
And the best areas?
A big oval in the middle.
The exact place where we told you not to go is the best place to be. It's recorded too, and later you could listen to the recording if you care to, if there was something that seemed interesting, and if you can even remember that long. Welcome also to people on Zoom. This is new for us to try to have functional Zoom. We had to bring in our own internet devices. So welcome John, David, CR, Linda, and ESD. Hope you can hear and see okay. You could send like a little thumbs up emoji if that's even remotely true. And again, I don't know what we're going to do about it, but I hope. Oh, good, thumbs up. You can just reassure us that we're okay. Good sound, says David. All right. All right. Now I feel both encouraged and my inner critic has more to be tripped up about because I know you can actually hear me. So for good or ill. Let me get some screens out of the way. All right. Well, here we are on the first day of sesshin. Naturally, there's a few rough edges and misunderstood things. Maybe you received a reminder, and it wouldn't be a reminder really if you didn't actually know, but a reminder that you're supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that. I hope you enjoyed your ill-begotten coffee, especially if you got it before we said, don't do that. Maybe you just let it sit there getting cold, feeling guilty, or depending on your conditioning, you drank it with great glee. I don't know. I'm sure it was a little bit complicated, having a cup of coffee. Or maybe it just rolled off you like a duck's back, right? We're so different, That's what's interesting to me over and over about these situations, like all situations, but here it's like you got everything under the magnifying glass, right? Because you don't get to distract yourself. And so it's always been interesting to find out, sometimes years later, about things that were important or horrible or didn't matter at all. And I'm never quite predicting which is going to be which for who, including, it's true for myself as well. So a little bit of that, we're straightening things out as we go. By day 7, it's pretty smooth. Then we let it go for a year. Then also the silence practice. You may have found yourself whispering something that seemed important at the time to somebody in the dining hall or on the path. Maybe you had some legit reason to think that it would matter, and maybe it did matter. Or maybe like me with most of the times I did that today, I thought about it later and said, I didn't have to say that at all, But it worked out just fine. So sorry when I broke the silence. It's not an easy thing, Our habits run deep, Of course they would. See something, say something. That's what they train you in, right? This is like see something, say nothing. There's so many opportunities to practice. It's not, the thing is, it's interesting, right? It's not just like we had to set up sort of a system to allow lots of zazen. And so zazen is when the practice is, and the rest of it is like following the rules because you're supposed to be good. No, the whole thing is practice, right? That's what's cool about it. And when there's something happening that doesn't seem that way, that can be like a good flag, a good, like, deep reminder. This whatever thing seems really dumb. This is not the practice. So it probably is, actually. It may take a while to figure out why. You have to let something go. Or maybe you're right and we just were doing it a dumb way. You may eventually conclude that. But look into it, really look into it as practice if you get reactive or distracted or annoyed or something. How is this the practice? Can you ask yourself that with a lot of humility? And maybe you'll discover something about your mind. There's so many ways we're practicing, right? How we move around, how we speak or don't speak, how we listen in the chanting time and try to harmonize our voices or doggedly insist that we're the one doing it in the right pace and the right tone until we let that go, It's supposed to be faster, it's supposed to be slower, It's, oh my goodness. Maybe this is just me, I don't know. So thank you, that's what I'm trying to say. Thank you for all your deep practice already. So much deep practice has already happened, not all of which are we even remotely aware of. And another really interesting thing about all this is that we create all these roles, R-O-L-E, different roles, jobs, practice positions. And each one's supposed to have a more or less clear area of stuff you're supposed to do. Dishes is fairly clear. Not so clear. But kinda. I don't even know what my role is anymore. And so I was thinking about that, like how powerful that practice is, because this is real life too, right? We have many roles that we play, and they more or less have some boundaries around them. I can tell when I'm in the role of father with my daughter, it looks different than when I'm in the role of coworker or the role of meditation teacher or something. And I can pretty much switch between them, usually. Sometimes I'm a little slow and I'm a little bit in the wrong role, and you can feel the friction that brings up. But the thing that's really interesting about all this, I think, from the point of view of the Dharma, is the identity that we build within our roles. And how easily we really kind of believe in it, and how that, in the end, may limit us and may cause us to suffer. We're trying to get better at Red Cedar at rotating roles, which is a key part of this actually working properly within the practice framework. You take on a role, okay, I'm the such and so, I'm the one who does this. Nobody else does it, I'm the one who does it, right? It's clear, maybe. And then eventually, you rotate out, like, okay, somebody else does it, no problem. But sometimes we feel kind of scarce. We have a habit of feeling scarcity in the Sangha, like we don't have enough people, so somebody is good at it, I'm like, okay, you go, And we leave them in there too long, and that can cause problems, because you over-identify with that role. But it's useful, too, to see that we do that, We have one wonderful, wonderful member, many wonderful members, the one I'm thinking of, very earnest, very hardworking, and circumstances were such that he was the main and only timekeeper for one of our practices. Week after week after week, he was the timekeeper. Ringing the bells, hitting the hon, He got really good at it, actually. I really appreciate it. I'm like, oh, good, it's handled, But then eventually it dawned on me or somebody, like, well, other people might want to learn that role. And so I had to say to him one day, okay, you're not the timekeeper next week. And you can imagine how that went over, It's very upsetting because it didn't sound to this person like, oh cool, other people could learn this. It felt and sounded and was, the truth of it was, I thought you thought I was okay. And now you're telling me I'm not okay, right? It was actually that. It felt terrible. But also it wasn't exactly me, right? I could have been a lot more organized and okay, it's for 1 month and be ready, you have to let it go, Some people don't have, do this in other ways, not that particular way, but so we're trying to be a little better about that. But whether we do it so-called right or so-called wrong, it's so valuable to see the ways we get tripped up and learn from that. Like, wow, I just hung my identity around the guy who rings the bell, Wow. Impressive, I learned about this experientially early in my training. I want to share a little story from back then. In the beginning of starting when I was 20 actually, my very early 20s, I sat a couple of practice periods at a residential big place, Green Gulch Farm Zen Center near San Francisco. And the first one, the Ino, now you all know what the Ino is, was this woman who went by her Dharma name, which was Fu. Maybe some of you know Fu Schroeder. This was the Fu of 35 years ago. So she was the Ino. She was a tall, strong woman. You could just feel that she'd been through a lot in her life and came out the other side. And to my 20-year-old self, her eyes especially were just like piercing, and kind of a little bit fierce. I was a bit intimidated by Fu. And I was also kind of like a babe in the woods. I didn't know about any of this stuff, But she was actually a pretty, strong Ino. No hesitation to move around, make announcements, and even silently just kind of grab hold of us and move us to the right places. Recently I learned that still goes on in Japan. I was at the big monastery and watching as the senior monks would actually reach out and grab the belts of the junior monks and literally put them in the right spot. Chess pieces. Anyway, so this is part of our tradition to this day. So she practiced that way. As a result, I didn't quite get it at the time, but as the result, this ended was very orderly, right? Things ticked along in great harmony. It's very beautiful. But yeah, she would not hesitate. One time I overslept somehow, which is hard to do because there's a loud bell outside your door, and then they're hitting the hon, and I still had some teenager energy in me. I was able to oversleep. And I was in my sleeping bag, kind of half awake, kind of had this, that kind of half-awake sense, like something's not right here. I'm not sure what's going on. That disoriented moment when you first wake up. And next thing I know, there's a sharp knock on the door, and this head sticks in the doorway. It's Ino Fu saying, "Time for Zazen!" She had big eyebrows, too. Her eyebrows went up. I may be exaggerating a little from my memory, but she was like Bodhidharma reborn in a different body. So I kind of feared but also appreciated Fu, admired her. Clearly a strong practitioner. I learned a lot, went back to college. A couple of years later, I came back for another practice period. And this time, Fu was the head student, the Shuso. She was not the Ino. And it was just mind-blowing to me. Someone had taken the Fu I remembered and completely reworked her psychological profile and personality into this kind, open, generous, sweet person who never corrected anybody, just smiled at people all the time. She gave me a wrist mala she'd made herself. I'm not sure why she gave it to me. And one time I was like, this is the same person, And then one time we were walking up a trail during the work period and chatting about this or that, and I was pretty shy, I would never have said this out loud, but somehow something I said in the chit-chat keyed her in to the fact that I was trying to catch up, what was going on with her. And she looks at me and smiles and says, "Yeah, I was one Mino Ino." In Red Cedar, we have not yet had a Mino Ino. Maybe one day. That's why we're so loose. And she said, and when I became Shuso, I went and asked my teacher, Reb Anderson was her teacher, how do you practice as Shuso? And he said, just be kind and support the Sangha. So that's what she was doing. That was her new role. The story I told myself, like this was more like the real her, and she was putting on a front to be the Mino Ino, but I don't know, Which one is the real Fu? There's a koan about that, actually. So which one is the real you, Is it the you as, list off your roles, I don't know what they are. Is it the you as this role, the you as that role? Which is the real you? So it's kind of cool, actually, at sesshin. We take on these roles under the microscope with way too much silence and time to worry and overthink things. And we can see ourselves cling to our roles or reject our roles or feel threatened by other people, overstepping our understanding of the boundaries of our role. I once had to have like almost a mediation because one person was in charge of creating a document for a Sangha meeting. I offered to go run it off. When I ran it off, I noticed there were no page numbers, so I hand wrote the page numbers on the bottom before I copied it. Thought I was being helpful. She felt like I really messed up her document. Was very upset. So roles, I was the one, not to trivialize it, was upsetting. I had overstepped. So anyway, enjoy your role, and we all have a role here, whether your name's on the list or not, you have a role. What does it mean to be a Zen student, That's a role, What does it mean to participate in the sesshin? You take up a role. What is your role sitting there between your two neighbors? What is the role you're imagining your neighbor is doing? Oh, this is that guy. This just helps us, right? It helps us surface our conditioning and respect our conditioning and be maybe a little overwhelmed by our conditioning sometimes. Maybe sometimes, though, a little moment of freedom from our conditioning. We might not even notice it, We might not even notice, I didn't get so triggered by that as usually I would have. So we're here in the lab, the ego lab. Maybe we should change the title of the event. 7-Day Ego Lab. You'll love it and hate it, guaranteed. Because you have one of the things. So speaking of overstepping roles, I do that a lot. The portion of the orientation yesterday that was about our Dokusan private interview system this year was the role of the Inos to explain. I think it was Desiree's turn at the moment they were trading off. And it's funny, like a change, right? Is it a big deal or no big deal? Who knows? Same stuff. This little system with the cards is what we do every week back home, so it's no big deal to us, but we've always done it a different way here, right? Actually, there's been more than one different way, and that's the funny thing about Zen stuff is once it changes, everyone thinks that's the way it always was, but actually, that's also a change, Anyway, for a while we've had like the numbers and the letters, and everybody, Norman's automatic, and these people you sign up, or you do this, or you do that. So now we got these little cards. And so I was worried. Maybe it's a little patronizing, some of these things that come up in my conditioning, sorry. Oh, this is going to be complicated for them. Really hard to understand. It's not that complicated. So anyway, we got to like where to put the cards, and I was like, oh, here's where to put them. I wanted to just make sure it was clear. Jumped in and told you the wrong thing. So put them behind you so that Jisha can actually see them. So you're facing the wall, put it behind you, right next to the little zabuton. You'll have to be a little bit mindful not to step on them, put them in the corner when you come back from Kenyan and stuff, and then the Jisha can walk behind you and see you want Dokusan. You put it in front of you. What's he supposed to be like? Is that a car down there? Oh, sorry to disturb you. Put it behind you. Sorry. Anyway, it's a lot to think about at sesshin. A lot of ways to overthink about it. If they give you the microphone in an hour, you might say a lot. But actually, I wanted to talk about Dōgen. We're having like a year of Dōgen at Red Cedar. So a little bit about Dōgen to refresh our memories. Eihei means like peaceful, abiding. Dōgen, I forget what Dōgen means. Do is the way. Eihei Dōgen lived from 1200 to 1253 and is revered, a revered figure, revered as the founding teacher of Soto Zen. As a young man, he famously went on a hero's pilgrimage. We love hero's pilgrimages in human cultures because he was dissatisfied with the Dharma understanding in Japan of the day. Sometimes you're reading the story, you don't realize that actually Buddhism had been deeply practiced in Japan for like 700 years by then, so it wasn't just like nobody had thought about these things that he thought of, but nonetheless, he wasn't satisfied. And he set out to go to where he felt he could find a true teacher and learn, resolve his doubts, understand the Dharma more deeply. So he did. He went to China at the age of 23, so just a little bit. Actually, I think I was 23 for the second half of my Fu story. So like that age. The guy was young, Many of our revered figures were really young, right? Crosby, Stills, and Nash, right? They were like 23, inventing these songs that'll live on forever. No wonder they went a little nuts and did all the stuff they did personally. And while there for 4 years, the middle of his 20s, he did indeed find his true teacher, had a deep and transformational experience in the Dharma, and returned home with a lot of zeal and a lot of energy to share what he learned, 27-year-old energy. In his writings, it doesn't sound like he sort of set out to he wasn't thinking, I'm going to start a school called blah, 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 but he did not suffer from much lack of confidence. He really was deeply feeling this is a really important way of practice, this is the way of practice, I got to share this with people. But in the end, his efforts and a handful of other individuals' efforts seem to have really been pivotal in turning the first pages of a big chapter change in Japanese Buddhism. The previous dominant schools fading, schools called Tendai and Shingon, a few other ones, Keigon, and Zen and Pure Land Buddhism coming to dominate the scene, which it has ever since. Although now Zen's kind of in decline, actually. So another chapter is happening. We're part of that chapter. So he was a big part of that, whether he set out to be or not. And I was thinking I think there's actually two main ways that Dōgen did this. His practice and his writing. And we tend now to think about his writing. But actually, I think his practice was more important. His own presence, his deep devotion to the Dharma day in and day out for the rest of his life, and it wasn't a long life. He died at 53. I'm older than that now. He started 2 monasteries, one after the other, where people practiced with him. And men and women did practice with him, mostly men, but women, we know he had important women students. Oh, that leads me to another sidebar. I noticed that my slow education into sexism and misogyny is taking a little more hold because I did notice that the guy sat down here and the woman carefully attended him. So anyway, I just want you to know I noticed that. It's our form, it makes sense, blah, 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 but I acknowledge I was taking the patriarchal seat there, so yeah. And this has been a male-dominated tradition, no question about it, with deep practice by women actually keeping the thing afloat, but not acknowledged nearly as much. So anyway, that's true too. So one of the main things that Dōgen brought was what he experienced in China. So it's the actual experience, not the ideas, not the weird little quirky, brilliant talks he gave, but the actual experience, I think, is what really mattered here. And there were versions of this in Japan, but he had a very thoroughgoing system that he learned in China where it's completely immersive and lived, how you learn Dharma, how you practice. So this is somewhat that way, what we're doing this week. But he brought the system of the monks, or separately the nuns, would live together and practice together, and everybody, like basically your home for the training period, and maybe for years, is one tatami mat, 1 meter by 2, 3 feet by 6-ish. In this one room called the monk's hall, the Sodo. So we tend to call it a zendo because we sit here and then we go other places to do other things, but that's where they did everything. It's where you sit, where you eat, and where you sleep. You got a little cabinet behind you that has a futon. They're pretty thin, FYI. We've been recently sleeping on these things, pretty thin. So you sleep on in your quilt, 1 bit of bedding, and your little teeny buckwheat pillow. We also tested that out recently. Not too comfortable. 24/7, you're with your brother monks, your sister nuns. And when you do happen to leave the building to go to another building, you do that all together too. You go to the bathroom together, you bathe together, you brush your teeth together, with little chants and rituals all along the way. There is 0 time to yourself and 0 choice about what you do ever. Except I'm sure there's little moments of rebellion, maybe somebody flicks their robe around the wrong way or something like that. We're human after all. So this is like the rock tumbler system of ego softening and destruction, Triggering your preferences and starving of them of fuel over and over and over again, These folks thought of other things they wanted to do, They're not zombies, They didn't like all this stuff necessarily. There maybe is a deeper buy-in than we would have started with, probably, likely. But little by little, for those for whom it works, it really is transformational. It really changes you. You really do come out a shiny Buddha, each in their own unique way. For the people for whom it works, that I think is really actually quite true. But now we understand a little more about trauma and our diverse psychologies and the impacts of systemic oppression like gender-based oppression and racial oppression and all the many thousands of varieties. And we do know that for some people that would be like the worst thing imaginable to do, right? Like really damaging. So we have this tradition, and we have an interesting chapter-turning opportunity to figure out, more or less, how do we use this well? How do we use this for the good? And be inclusive for people for whom really tight rules aren't actually that helpful. So we say stuff in the beginning of the sesshin that you never would have heard there, The Ino introducing the young monks to the monastery would not say, if you can't sit the full schedule, leave me a note. That would be unimaginable. It would be more like Mino Ino all the time. Fu did not say to me, oh, are you tired? She was channeling this rock tumbler system. And it did actually work for me, I was annoyed, but I got up. I sat. At the end of that first training period, or at the end of the 7-day sesshin that it ended with, somehow what popped in my mind with great clarity was, that was the hardest thing I've ever done, and that was the best thing I've ever done. I couldn't figure out how those statements went together, but they clearly did. Clearly did. So it's like that. And we all know plenty of people who've left the practice because this kind of stuff is not right for them. And then there's also the great suffering of not being sure which camp you're in, which is probably all of us. Like, should I? Should I write that note? Should I stick it out? It's dynamic, so we experiment. So anyway, I think that's really the core way that Dōgen kind of set the dominoes falling. It's in support of Zen ascending. And the Zen that followed his teachings and lineages that later on got named Soto Zen. He didn't have that idea of Soto, I don't think that word ever occurred to him. It's later. It spread all over the country. Now there's 14,000 Soto Zen temples, but not actually enough monks to take care of them, but that's another story. The other branch of Zen, Rinzai, there's a third and a minor fourth one. That's another story also, but anyway, Rinzai kind of specialized in serving the elite in the capital. They had a little different slant on things, but very similar practice, really, when it comes down to it. But actually what we talk about now with Dōgen are his writings. So I want to share one of his writings today. That's what I'm trying to get to here. But the funny thing is, somehow it seems worth it to me to know some context. And the funny thing is that at the time his writings actually weren't that important. He would write out his talks, and so he'd leave, for posterity, his written out talk. Or maybe a few of his close students. He had one particular who was just an eager beaver named Eijo, and he copied and wrote everything down. Maybe a few of his monks, friends, and students would write stuff down, copy things. He wrote letters. He wrote stuff that appears to be more him expressing himself like an essayist, and there wasn't really such a thing then, which then he'd also usually share as talks. So we have those. There was a little bit of woodblock printing, but not much in Japan at the time. And as far as I know, I could be wrong about this stuff wasn't set in woodblock type, and nobody made 100 copies or anything like that. It'd be like 5 copies. And they got spread around a little bit because monks would visit, and make a copy or be offered a copy that was around so they could take it back to their temple. But then the funny thing is these original scrolls written by Dōgen were not things to read, actually. They were sacred objects. Especially a couple of generations later, the longer someone's dead, right? Even just having been president only 4 years ago, then suddenly, right? It's after the people, anyway. And so these were revered as sacred objects. They were put on the altar or put in the treasury and maybe taken out once a year on Dōgen's special day, kind of like the Catholics and their relics, So people didn't much read Dōgen for hundreds of years. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Nowadays, you think about Dōgen, you're like, oh man, these amazing writings that have been read and studied for so many generations. Well, yeah, but after 500 years on the shelf, they were. So anyway. The cool thing is a lot of these writings did survive, and there's an enormous catalog, and it's kind of hard to get your mind even around all the Dōgen things you could read, And they're pretty hard to read, so more than most any of us will get through in a lifetime. I wonder how many people are there who read all of Dōgen's work, Most all of it's been translated into English, I think, and that's a recent statement, probably. But even Japanese speakers have a hard time because he wrote in a quirky way, mixing in Chinese quotations and using strange grammar and deliberately trying to mess with our conditioned minds the way he wrote. And he also called several of his collections by one title, the same title with different, prefixes and suffixes, if you will. The title is Shobogenzo, which means treasury of the true Dharma, I, to the quotation from earlier Buddhism. So he definitely did not suffer from low esteem. What if I turned something into Tricycle Magazine and called that? I just want to share with you that I've written the treasury of the true Dharma, I. Please study this. And they'd be like, who are you? So anyway, the one I want to share today and the next couple talks I'll give, I'm giving 3 talks, I think, at this year's sesshin, is called Gakudo-Yojinshu. Gakudo-Yojinshu, which means points to watch in practicing the way. I thought that would be good for sesshin. Points to watch in practicing the way. It's one of 3 known pieces that he wrote soon after returning from China. And I only just learned about this one recently, so that's why I say, wow, he wrote so much. You might have heard of Bendawa, something like discourse on practicing the way. Sometimes it's included in one of the Shobo Genzos, but it doesn't look like he intended it to be. But an early essay he wrote. And you've probably heard of Fukan's Zazengi, which is actually in our chant books. We'll chant it tomorrow. His recommendations and instructions for Zazen. So this is a 3rd piece written within the first 3 or 4 years of his return from China. Less known, maybe just because nobody got around to translating it, you know. It's a lot of work to translate this stuff. To do it well, you have to be a deep Chinese scholar, and slightly easier with computerized technology now. The entire Chinese canon is digitized, so they can search on chunks of characters and find out a little bit easier. Oh, he's quoting this thing, because he never explains what he's quoting, you know, or rarely does. So maybe somebody looked at this one early on and said, this one's too hard, or this one's not that interesting. So us English-speaking Dōgen friends never heard of it. This translation is from Shohaku Okamura, a hard-working Dōgen fan, if ever there was one. So it's written in 10 short chapters, and I've rambled on long enough that we'll get to the first paragraph of the first chapter today. I learned this, honestly, this is how Norman always starts things too, so it just got into me. So the 10 short chapters actually have titles. Chapter 1 of Points to Watch For in Practicing the Way is called The Necessity of Arousing Bodhi Mind. The Necessity of Arousing Bodhi Mind. So it's about our attitude and spirit and mind. So we can look at this, each of us, in our own way. And it's not a one-time thing, it's a continuous question, right? What mind am I bringing forth right now? What mind is arising? You can ask connected questions to try to surface it, because it's hard to tell, you know, because we basically think, what? It's just my mind, you know, it's like, that's how it always is. But actually, there's many different minds arising, and we can encourage some, and maybe stop feeding others. Not that we can control particularly, but we can encourage. So you might ask yourself, why am I here? That's a good way to wonder about the Bodhi mind, whether it's arising or not, or how it's arising. Why am I here? Why did I come to sesshin? Why are you here, actually? It's not a simple question. So you might practice with that. Why am I here? You could ask yourself that in Zazen, and walking along the paths, trying to get to sleep. Why am I here? Maybe it'll come up with there may be different punctuation at the end, you know, depending on the mood, you know. Why am I here? Why am I here? What the? Yes, I know why I'm here. Wait a minute, why was it again? So the opening paragraph is full of references. I'll try not to unpack all of them, but just let this wash over you and I'll make a few points. So this is how he starts the discussion about why am I here, about Bodhi mind, which he says is the most important thing. It is a necessary first ingredient. Here's Dōgen. Though there are many names for Bodhi mind, they all refer to the one mind. The ancestral master Nagarjuna said that the mind that solely sees impermanence of this world of constant appearance and disappearance is called Bodhi mind. The ancestral master Nagarjuna said that the mind that solely sees the impermanence of the world of constant appearance and disappearance is called Bodhi mind. Therefore, I think it would be appropriate to talk about Bodhi mind as the mind that sees impermanence. So he's got a source here. It's not just his opinion. So that's interesting, huh? Impermanence is the key ingredient. He goes on. Truly, when you see impermanence, egocentric mind does not arise. Neither does desire for fame and profit. When you see impermanence, egocentric mind does not arise. Neither does desire for fame and profit. Out of fear of time slipping away too swiftly, practice the way, as if you were trying to extinguish a fire enveloping your head. Reflect on the transiency of bodily life. Practice as diligently as the Buddha did when he stood tiptoe for 7 days. Maybe you never heard of that practice. So life, our bodies and life are impermanent. He goes on. Even when you hear the melodious music of Kinara or the sound of the Kalavinka bird flattering you, it is only the evening breeze blowing in your ears. Even when you see a beauty like Mosho or Seishur, it is merely a drop of morning dew passing before your eyes. Concludes this part saying, when you have become distanced from the bondage of the objects of the senses, you will naturally be in accord with the principle of Bodhi mind. It's about impermanence. And here we're not wiping out egocentric mind, it just simply doesn't arise. It's about the impermanence of our life and the urgency of practice. And don't get too distracted by cool stuff. That was the last part. Don't get too distracted by cool stuff. It's nice, but autumn breeze, morning dew, gone in a flash. So this is pretty interesting, right? What would the mind that sees and really gets impermanence feel like? What would that actually be like? If you could really see that there's literally nothing to hold on to, nothing fixed, everything changing, everything appearances that are appearing and disappearing. And that's how it actually is. So what would that be like? It's not too hard to think about this in terms of what wouldn't happen. Like if you really got this, it's easy to think of some things that wouldn't happen, right? Like you wouldn't be annoyed that they changed something, right? Here or anywhere, right? Because you'd be like, well, of course, yeah. Sure. They changed it. Everything changes, you know? I think your mind wouldn't even get as far as, well, I guess I was used to it that way. It's okay that they changed it. I don't mind. Like that's already too far. You know? That's already assuming permanence. You assume they're always going to do it this way. That's assuming permanence. And then it changed, and then the halfway practice here is like, all right, I can accept some impermanence here. All right. You can have impermanence this time. But no, really seeing impermanence, like that wouldn't occur to you. You're like, yeah, okay. Put out the card, got it. Whatever it is, you know. So that's simple enough, but of course it must go deep, much more deeply. How would we relate to each other if we really saw each other as truly impermanent and ourselves as truly impermanent? You can see all the ways we judge and put people in boxes that it would not occur to the mind to do, right? You would never think, oh, he's always that way. She's that kind of person. That's making permanence. And what would this leave room for, right? What would this leave room for? So here we really need our imaginations. Buddhist teachings kind of like never talk about positive outcomes. Maybe that's why Zen's always going to be a small movement, you know? Talks a lot about suffering. Talks about freedom from suffering, but you hear freedom from suffering, what's the word that sticks in your mind, you know? Not the freedom half. And when there is a benefit, it's usually described as just not the bad thing, you know? Wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a mind that was imbued with non-hating? You're like, okay, great. So we have to kind of use our own language and imagination here to imagine a person, ourselves, who really saw impermanence. Gave people full grace to express in whatever way they're expressing in this moment, because we don't assume anything from the prior moments, even if we spend a lifetime with this person. Right? Relationships would never get stale and old. We might realize sooner I shouldn't be married to this person. That's possible, right? Right? It's also possible, right? Because that's also a belief in permanence, right? We're going to be married forever, right? That's permanence. Or maybe, we chose to be married and we're constantly changing, and I'm happy to meet the me of you meets the you of me of now meets the you of now, and isn't this cool? Here we are. Presumably there'd be a lot of acceptance, a lot of patience. Presumably there'd be a lot of compassion. When you're sort of like halfway free of something, you can get even more judgy. Have you noticed that? That happens a lot in the Zen shops. In your mind, or sometimes, out loud. You really shouldn't be so attached to that. Right? That's my attachment beating you up, right? Using Buddha's terminology. Right? But no, if we're free of this, we just feel sad. We feel sad and empathetic and compassionate. We don't try to fix the person, because how could we fix anybody? It's all impermanent. Somebody's stuck in something. Maybe there's some little way we can help or be kind or give them a smile or just leave them be. There's a reason why Buddha would always have this little half smile, right? Just like, you do you, monks. You got this. And then he'd teach for hours. So what would it be? This is really a sincere question. I like to joke around a little bit, but what would it really be? If you saw impermanence, not just occasionally, but as your default mode, if you arose Bodhi mind in that way. So he says that's the most important thing. And then, being Dōgen, he's got to go on for some pages here, saying it other ways. His next way he says it is to make sure that we really wake up that this is serious. This is not just some cool religious idea. He brings up death, Brings death up right away in this first paragraph. Time is slipping by. Reflect on the transiency of your body and let that inspire you to practice diligently, as the Buddha did when he stood on tiptoe for 7 days. I can't resist unpacking that story. Feel free to move your legs and stuff. I don't want to make you, I'm not trying to torture you. So this reference comes from a Jataka tale. These are the early Buddhist stories of Shakyamuni Buddha's previous lives. It took Shakyamuni many lifetimes to be in the right condition to awaken as the Buddha. It's not just the whole under the Bodhi tree secular humanist thing. He had a really good meditation practice, and he let go of that terrible asceticism, and then he just got it, right? No, the traditional understanding is this is like 50 lifetimes later, that this was even possible. So it's a slow road to awakening in that frame. So anyway, in an earlier life, he was a bodhisattva. I don't know if he was named. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. And he was deeply inspired by the Buddha of that era, who was named Pusha Buddha. Pusha Buddha wasn't saying anything, he was meditating. And he was just glowing, in a deep samadhi. And Shakyamuni in his prior life was so moved by devotion, just washed over him, that he recited verses of praise while standing on tiptoe for 7 days. Maybe Pusha Buddha was up on a high seat, that's traditional. We should roll in here a platform for me to climb up on top of to give you this talk. So he just did it. He didn't think about it, He's like, I should do a practice now. And, this is hard, but I'm going to keep doing it. It matters. He just was overcome, and for 7 days, he practiced that way. So now I got to tell you a Japan story. We were in Japan in April, several of us. we met somebody who has that kind of spirit, Nice guy, too, Nice guy. He's one of the famous marathon monks. Have you heard about this? So his main claim to fame, and no fame on his side, but that's the phrase we would use, was he had done this marathon practice, 100-day stretches every morning in the middle of the night, 30 to 50-mile trots through the woods, making offerings, and just unbelievable physical, intense devotional practices. This crazy 7-day retreat he did, he told us about, with no eating, sleeping, or even drinking. Yes, that does sound dangerous, and it is. So anyway, we heard about all that, and we're hanging out, and he's kind of telling us about stuff. And we asked him, did you ever think of quitting? And he was like, what? Repeat the question. Didn't make sense to him. Anyway, then we were walking around, and almost as like a sidebar, he tells us that he basically did this tiptoe practice for 49 days. Like, oh my God, It's like mind blown after mind blown with this guy. We were in front of these two small, kind of medium-sized, small, not too big buildings, practice buildings. They had a hallway attaching the two. And he explained that these are the 49-day practice halls. And you get a choice as a Tendai monk in this school. This one's for the just sitting for 49 days, and it really means that, just sitting. And this one's for the just standing. He chose just standing. And what you do is you stand there reciting mantras for 49 days straight without sitting down or lying down or rest. I think you did get a little bit of drinking water, I can't remember. He did share that if he fainted, they let him sleep for a while before he got back up. Yeah. And for him it was the right thing to do, right? That's the amazing thing, right? There's such a range of what's right for us as humans, and it's hard to know what that is. He grew up as a monk, so maybe that helped. He was kind of adopted by the monastic family as a boy. But yeah, anyway, so this stuff's real, actually. 21st century real stuff. And then to close, and we'll get out of here. Then Dōgen brings up sensory pleasure. So this is important to think about a little bit for our sesshin. Laura's food is definitely yummy. Nothing is inherently true, but that is. So we can enjoy it, but not lose sight of why we're here. Right? We're not just bearing some hours of sitting because we're going to get a meal later. Right? And so Dōgen uses some traditional stories and metaphors, music of this and the bird of that and the beauty of this, but it's about sensory pleasure. How do we meet sensory pleasure? And here too, to see its deep impermanence. He doesn't knock the pleasure, that's important to notice, right? Enjoy the beautiful music and the beautiful sights, but understand it's no different from the evening breeze blowing in your ears or the morning dew passing before your eyes. You wouldn't be like, I need a jar, I gotta catch some evening breeze, Or how can I keep that dewdrop from drying out? So beautiful. I want to take that home, put it on the shelf. So when you're excited to get the recipe, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's okay. So practicing with impermanence, appreciating letting go of the senses, practicing with impermanence. Sometimes this is pleasant, sometimes it's unpleasant. We do it within a strong container with these roles that we won't ever get quite exactly right. And when something gets stirred up, here it is. Here's the mind that believes in permanence, the mind that believes it should be organized a particular way, that rigid mind. We come by it honestly, it's not your fault. But if we want to be more free, don't you think we should do something about this? Investigate it, look into it. Really, give ourselves to this opportunity. Trying to get comfortable at sesshin is a little bit like, one of those things, right? It's fine, do your best, but then it leads us to all kinds of stuff that maybe doesn't help us that much, There's something deeper afoot than if they only had the right fill in the blank. Right? Our deep conditioning is here on display. So we got to be humble and generous with each other. We are all competent, intelligent people, and we are all real dopes, you know. Right? It's true, isn't it? You know? Narrow-minded, reactive, you know. Loving and generous, all in one glorious package. And I think Dōgen understood this. You know, he had his own kind of narrow religiosity that he lived through, but you can feel it here. He's only 27, he's in like 31 by the time he writes this. But he's feeling into there is beauty in the world, you know. And there's something deeper. Okay. Thanks for listening. Our intention equally extend to every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I